Let me hit record to the cloud. So that's the framing. Can alternative energy sources replace fossil fuels? So let's deal with the two big ones here, at least in the United States. Let's talk about solar for a little bit, and then we'll go on to wind. So with solar power, which is currently the fastest growing source of alternative energy here in the US, as I've commented before, you have to look at the geography of the region, right? And so this diagram here shows the solar resource in the US. It also includes Spain and Germany, just as an aside. And the scale on the bottom here, if I can just circle this down on the bottom of the screen here, this shows the resource expressed in terms of how many kilowatt hours per square meter on the ground per year. So in other words, looking at the average amount of solar power that you can extract. And you can see that you've got, as you would expect, right? You've got this big bubble of potential solar as a resource here in the Southwest, desert Southwest, right? Lots of heat, clear skies, and so on. That doesn't mean to say that solar is not viable in a place like Central or East Texas. We're just looking at the greatest resource, right? So if you're keen on building a utility plant that is solar panels, putting it in the Pacific Northwest is a bit tricky, right? Because of the cloud cover. So that's the resource, okay, as to where solar is most viable. And again, you can see when you look at the eastern seaboard here, the suggestion isn't that you cannot have solar here in the Southeast. It's just that it's not as intense as a resource as it would be out in the Southwest. There are broadly speaking three types of solar facilities, or three approaches to using solar power, right? And my goal here, everyone, is not to go into a detailed look at the engineering of solar. That's beyond the scope of the course. But I want to make you aware of, when we talk about solar, we're talking about solar at essentially three different levels, three different scales, and they're differentiated here in terms of temperature scales. So there's what we call low temperature solar thermal, okay? And often this is referred to as passive solar. So this is using solar power in conjunction with essentially smart green design. And this comes down to, in effect, orienting your building, what you make your buildings out of, and how you orient those buildings to take advantage of the distribution of solar in and of itself, right? So for example, if you want to use solar passively to heat your buildings during the winter, right? Then you would look at the angle of incident radiation coming in, and you would design and orient your windows and your buildings to take advantage of that. And you might have, for example, on the floor here or on the wall, some substance, or you may paint it a certain color that would aid in the absorption of solar and heat things up, as opposed to the orientation of a building, or to try and protect these rooms with the summer sun, which is more directly overhead. So low temperature solar thermal is simply moving warm air around and through buildings collectively, if that makes sense, right? We're not using any engineering technology to create electricity here in low temperature solar thermal. Then there is mid-temperature solar thermal. So with mid-temperature solar thermal, guys, this includes things like water heaters and solar panels that you would put on the roof, right? And mid-temperature, this would be collecting the sun's rays and using that to heat a fluid, almost certainly water, right? So here's an example of a solar panel on the roof. This is a solar water heater with a dark surface in the background that will absorb the sunlight, that heats up the water in these tubes, that then flows into a water tank, right? So that heats the water, and then that is used either as a hot water source within the building, or to heat the ambient air within that building. But the bottom line is here, you are capturing sunlight here to heat a fluid like water. Again, this is not to create electricity. This is to use as a hot water system. So mid-temperature solar thermal. But a lot of the the future, I think, looks at high temperature solar, right? So with high temperature solar thermal, what we're doing here is we're using mirrors, okay, parabolic mirrors, to concentrate the sunlight and to use that sunlight and focus it on a receiver that heats generally synthetic oil, right, to a very high temperature that then is pumped through a condenser to create steam. Okay, so this is in a sense like nuclear, except you're not using a nuclear reaction to create the heat. The heat is being created by capturing the sunlight, focusing it on a central source and heating that central source, right? So high temperature thermal. In other words, you're focusing it to boil water to create steam. So the photograph on the right here is a solar tower in California. And here you've got a series of parabolic mirrors that capturing the sun and then focusing and redirecting or reflecting that sunlight here towards a solar tower. And that's heating the synthetic oil system within the solar tower. The next photograph here, let me just move on. This is a solar thermal plant out in, also in California. This is Genesis. I'm sorry, I don't have a scale here, but just as a frame of reference, you can drive a Ford F-150 truck underneath these parabolic mirrors, okay? They turn, they swivel, so they actually follow the sun. And again, this is high temperature solar thermal because those sun's rays are being directed onto the central pipe here. And that central pipe has a synthetic oil. And then that is heated to very high temperatures to heat water to create steam. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? So low temperature solar thermal is just moving air. Mid temperature solar thermal is heating water to use as a water source. High temperature solar thermal is to heat a synthetic fluid to very high temperatures to actually then generate electricity. That's one type of solar power that is different to what you see here, right? So the second major set of solar technologies that are being deployed worldwide is PV, right? Photovoltaic. So PV cells, these are the solar cells that would be used to power calculators and laptops and so on, right? So when you've got a solar battery or a solar watch, okay, that's clearly not using high or medium temperature solar thermal to heat anything. So what's happening here is that the sunlight strikes the photovoltaic cell. That cell is made up of various substances. I'm not an engineer to explain this, but my understanding is that these thin film PV cells are made up of various things like phosphorus and silicon sandwiches, okay? And the sunlight strikes that, and that splits off electrons to generate the electricity directly in the cell. So this is a PV cell solar farm in Costa Rica at a fairly small scale, right? Generating small scale electricity to a local village. Here, on the other hand, is a PV farm in China. And what do you notice about this photovoltaic farm in China? That looks quite cute. Anybody see it?
The pandas?
Yeah, right. So there are several of these. There's about 100 of these going up in China, and they've done it. I think it looks quite interesting, but you can see there's a couple of panda bears there, and you can Google this, and you can look at various ones on Google Earth. They're pretty cool. This is a PV plant in China. So it is a plant that generates, or has, no, that doesn't generate. Let me take that back. It has a capacity. It has an installed power capacity of about 100 megawatts. Okay. Remember, when we talked about coal, I said your average coal-fired power plant is about 500 megawatts, right? So here is a solar plant that is about 1/5 of the installed capacity of a coal-fired power plant. This one in China covers about 250 or so acres, right? So what's one of the, maybe not one of, what's the great challenge when it comes to solar? If this is a 100 megawatt power plant, do you think that this power plant actually generates 100 megawatts of power at any given moment? Or not?
No, because
Okay.
it's dependent on the sun.
So say that again, Claire.
No, because it's dependent on the sun, and the sun doesn't shine consistently all the time.
Okay, excellent, right? So please bear that in mind, everybody. Let me see if I can get a color that shows up here. So we've got a plant here that has an installed capacity. In other words, all of these solar panels add up to potentially generating 100 megawatts of power, right? Instantaneous power. Okay, that is the theoretical amount of power that can be generated from this particular power plant. Okay, the amount of electricity that's actually generated, right? The amount of power that's actually generated would be significantly less than that. Okay, the only way you could get 100 megawatts of power out of that plant, as Claire has articulated, is if you had the sun shining for 24 hours a day. And if every single one of those solar panels was delivering electricity at its maximum efficiency, right? And this is something we're going to come back and address a little later when we look at wind. Okay, so let me get this out of the way right now, everyone. We have, with every single energy source, something known as a capacity factor, a CF, a capacity factor, right? And what is the capacity factor? The capacity factor is the actual amount of power that is generated relative to how much is installed on the ground, right? It's expressed as a percentage, okay? So we've got 100 megawatts of solar panels on the ground here, installed. What do you think the capacity factor is of a solar plant? Let me preface that. It obviously depends if you built the plant in Phoenix, Arizona, or Seattle, Washington. But on average, you looked at your typical solar powered plant in the southwest of the United States. What would your guess be, everybody, as a capacity factor for solar? Just as a guess. What do you think? As a percentage?
30%.
Ooh, that's a good guess, Matt. 30%. Okay. So if I said to you, Matt, that this plant has a capacity factor of 30%, that means that instead of generating 100 megawatts of power at any given moment, it's only generating 30, right? Matt, if you were the CEO, if you were a power developer and you came back to me and I was an investor and you said, we're building a power plant and it's got a capacity factor of 30%, I'd be like, count me in. Okay, that's pretty good. Why? Because, well, half the time, let's say half the time the sun doesn't shine. So your maximum is 50% right off the bat, okay? That means the other half, that solar plant is operating at its most efficient when the sun is shining, which in and of itself doesn't happen, right? So please, everybody, just bear that in mind when we're talking about, when we're looking at what we call a levelized conversation, right? If we're trying to compare solar with wind, with biomass, with nuclear, with coal, oil, and natural gas, if we lay it all out on a table, this is a really important part of the discussion. What is the capacity factor of a particular technology, okay? And the reality is the capacity factor of a technology like solar and wind can never match the capacity factor of something like hydroelectric or natural gas or nuclear. And at the end of this whole conversation, I'm going to come back and compare the capacity factors, but I just wanted to get that out now. Does that make sense to anybody? Anybody got a question on that? That was a solid guess, man. 25% is considered reasonable for solar.
So for solar, like obviously there's not very much like global that we can do with it as far as right now with the technology that we have, but like, do you think it's beneficial for like as an individual consumer? Like, would you get enough benefit from it? Because obviously expenses have gone down significantly in the last few years to implement, but it seems as that there's a way to, as a just an individual consumer, take care, use the benefits?
So that's a great question. I haven't addressed that yet, and thanks for that, Matt, because what you're implying or kind of explicitly stating here is the question of scale, right? So when we look at this image in front here, and this is a solar plant that has 100 megawatts, okay? At this scale, you've got to generate all of that electricity. There's the question of storage that we're going to talk about. Then you get that into a grid, then you get that to the homes. That's still a relatively inefficient way of generating electricity, right? But on an individual consumer basis, if you're putting solar panels on your roof, okay, at that scale, it is actually much more efficient because one, you have much greater control over it, right? Does that mean you can go off the grid? Maybe, but probably not in an urban setting where you have, especially here where you have very high air conditioning requirements, right? But to just get straight to your question, absolutely, it is cost efficient to do it on an individual. So we call that distributed solar, right? Distributing that onto individual houses, okay? There's a really interesting thing on YouTube on the controversy on distributed solar in Hawaii. You see a lot of them on the roofs. I saw that a couple months ago when I rented a car and drove out of Honolulu, and you drive around and you see a lot of solar panels on roofs there. The power companies don't want any part of that, right? They're losing money by not doing it through a centralized system. Does that make sense, Matt? It's a good question. Scale is a critical question.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Like I said, because it just seems like you can get way more benefit out of it right now as an individual than you would be implementing as a full-time system.
Unless you live in a country like that's on the screen here, right? Where you have such buying power and where a government can say, you know what, we're going to build 300 power plants at 100 megawatts each. And guess what? They do it, and they do it in an extraordinarily short amount of time, which of course is a whole nother issue, right? Deals with labor and access to capital and so on. But your point is well taken, Matt, and it's a valid one. Here's the largest solar plant in the world. Just incidentally, this is Badla Solar in India. This is a 2.54 gigawatt layout. So anything you see over here, let me just change the color here. So these are all PV cells, right? All of this. This is taken from Google Earth. 2.54 gigawatt. Let me put that in a context for you. Again, your average coal-fired power plant is 500 megawatts. So this is 2.54 gigawatts, right? And there's 1,000 megawatts in a gigawatt. So this is basically 5 coal-fired power plants, or the equivalent of almost 2.5 nuclear power plants. And if you're struggling with scale here, just look at this on the left here. I know this is a bit of a blurry image, but this is Fort Worth, right? There's Bluebonnet Circle right there. There's Amon Carter Stadium, just to orient you, okay? Here's the Trinity. That yellow circle that I put around here, which essentially stretches down from IHOP on South University to south of I-20 here, and this is I-35. That is the size of all the solar panels on this power plant, right? So Matt, getting back to your point, it's not that it's uneconomical to do it when you can build at the scale and get it into a grid when you've got that many consumers. And your second, one of your comments earlier there, Matt, was the cost has come down, and that is true. When I started in the energy game 15 years ago, when we started the wind research here at TCU, solar had to be heavily subsidized, right? It was like the first flat screen TV I ever bought in 2003 was a DLP that cost me $4,500, and it was still 2 feet deep and weighed a ton, right? Now you can walk into Costco and buy a plasma for, I don't know what, 500, 1,000, something like that, right? So the price has come down dramatically. To come back and just continue a little bit here on Matt's comment about distributed versus utility scale. Here is the biggest planned project. It hasn't been built yet. Construction hasn't started, but here's an interesting one in Australia. So here you've got an enormous solar resource, right, in the northern outback. And this is a 10 gigawatt PV array that is supposedly going to be built by 2027. COVID has delayed the construction. This is not just to keep electrons within Australia. They're then building a pipeline and getting that into Singapore. And the Singaporean government and venture capitalists there have helped with that, right? So scale is something that people are looking at. Okay, let me wrap up with solar. Let's get back to environmental issues for a second. Here's a headline from a newspaper in Arizona, and the story was Big Solar's Death Panels. So that doesn't sound like a very green headline if you like solar power, right? If you're a proponent of renewable energy. So what was this all about? So this was about a solar farm, and actually a series of farms, but this dealt with one particular solar farm in California, actually, right on the California-Nevada border. And the focus was on this creature, the desert tortoise, right? The desert tortoise, as you can imagine, lives in the desert, and it's an endangered species, something we're going to talk about later on in the course. And when you put solar panels in a large area like a solar farm, one is, does it change the microclimate? Yes, it does. It warms up the surrounding area. But secondly, you disturb the surface, right? You can see that from the images in China or in India. You know, there is a large footprint when it comes to putting solar farms down, right? So here's a trade-off, and this area has been a really interesting case study on this whole notion of green energy, and what we kind of talk about is the green on green debate. Many people in the region want renewable energy. They want solar, right? Because it's clean, there are no emissions. Yes, there's the whole argument about, well, you've got to build the panels and you've got to transport them, and what are the rare earth materials that go into them, and that is an issue for sure. I'm not trying to gloss over that. But they want this green renewable energy. The problem is they don't want it to impact something like the desert tortoise, right? And so in one example, there was a developer who wanted to build a solar farm, and the environmental movement came, the environmental lawyers representing a number of different interest groups sued them because they wanted them to move 25 tortoises that were being impacted by a particular farm to another location. That would have cost about $30 million to move these tortoises and find another habitat for them, right? It was about $1.2 million per tortoise. And people were going, are you nuts, right? Why are we spending $1 million a tortoise to put in a solar farm? But it was a very legitimate lawsuit, still not resolved. Just incidentally, this is going to be the biggest solar project. Looks like it's going to go ahead. About 50 kilometers just outside of Las Vegas. This is the Gemini solar project on about 7,000 acres. This will have an generation capacity of 690 megawatts, right, on the ground. It's $1 billion. The interesting thing here is, along with this, is they are building a 380 megawatt storage facility of batteries. And that remains one of the great challenges with renewables, with both wind and solar. Remember, everybody, this is a non-distributed, this is a non-dispatchable source of energy. Okay? In other words, we can only generate electrons when the sun's shining. We know that. We can only generate electricity when the wind is blowing and the turbines are moving, right? So when we are generating electrons, okay, from solar or wind, and if the demand is not high, then what do? It's wasted energy. So we have to solve the storage problem. And this solar plant is coming along with almost 400 megawatts of energy storage. What that means is that if the demand isn't high, right, and the sun's shining, you can still generate electricity, pump that electricity into the batteries and store that until the demand is required, and then you can discharge it. I don't know if that makes sense, but that is where a lot of research is being done at the moment on how do we improve the storage, the storability of energy in battery systems at wind and solar facilities. There's also quite a lot of work. So here's downtown Vegas in the bottom left. Here is the Gemini project in the northeast of this photograph here. The two little other photographs here, there's a lot of work going on at the moment the top one, that fence, is to see, instead of moving desert tortoises, can we build fences around these solar farms so that the tortoise can get in and out, right? So these are kind of little doggy doors for tortoises. And the environmental impact associated with that is being looked at. The bottom one is also dealing with habitat, right? Replanting of vegetation and habitat. Again, I'm not trying to minimize the importance of the desert tortoise here, and many people take this extremely seriously. Here is the executive director of an organization called Defenders of Wildlife, and I think it's pretty obvious what, where they're coming from. Quote, "There is no justification for this project that outweighs the importance of the desert tortoise, its habitat, and the Bureau of Land Management's obligations to use its full authority to take actions that will contribute to the recovery of this threatened species," right? So here we are trying to generate electricity that is clean, efficient, and reliable in a part of the world where you have a wonderful resource, okay, where you've got a maximum potential to use solar. You've got growing populations, certainly in Nevada, right? Less so in California, but I know I have two friends that just moved to the Vegas area. They're going to need electricity, and now we've got a backlash against a solar farm, a series of solar farms, because of a particular species. So let me stop there and see if you folks have any thoughts or comments on that. Does that seem like insane and ridiculous? If you were involved in this type of consulting work, what would your stance be? Would you be fighting for the desert tortoise and saying, take your solar farm elsewhere? Or can we trade off the value of 25 tortoises and put in a solar farm? Not easy. What do you guys think? Any thoughts? Or should we just say, you know what, we're not going to put the solar farm in, we're going to build a coal-fired power plant? Tricky.
I think at the end of the day, it's all a cost benefit analysis. While we have to give every living thing its due, you also have to realize the advancement of, the species being that we're at the top of the food chain. Are we willing to sacrifice our longevity for something that is, lower? Now that seems very self-centered, but at the end of the day, we all have that self-preservation derived directly in our code.
Right. Yeah. No, it's tough, right? So if you love desert tortoises, someone would come at that and say, yeah, I don't think so, Mr. Perk. Sorry, I just, the desert tortoise has an equal right and an equal footing on this planet as you, me, or anybody else, So there's this sliding scale, right? Some people would go, this is ridiculous. People don't want to live in the dark. And at some point, dear greenies, you're going to want reliable electrons, right? And if those electrons can come from solar panels where we've got the resource, there's no emission, we're not dealing with any, atmospheric pollution. This is great for the environment, and it's great for the climate. And yeah, unfortunately, we may lose a few tortoises along the way. So I'm just trying to, illustrate the complexity sometimes of these arguments. But I agree. Okay, what else? Anything else on solar? We're going to talk about some similar issues here when it comes to wind. Okay, so I am sure, or at least I assume, that many of you, how are we doing on time? 1:45. Okay, cool. Let's get through a couple of themes here in wind, then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and continue with wind, right? So this is one renewable technology that I feel certainly more comfortable and a bit more experienced in talking about. And I assume that a number of you have seen these, right? Have been up either close and personal or have driven out west on I-20 towards El Paso or Sweetwater, or maybe some of you from California. So let's hear from you. Who of you either live or have lived in pretty close proximity to these things? Anybody have experience in the wind space? Who's been up close and personal with them? Anybody?
I've just driven by them.
Yeah. So what do you think, Claire, when you drive by them or when you see an image like this? This incidentally is from West Texas. What do you think personally? What comes to mind?
I was younger. It was like really ominous to see, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, back then I didn't really know the use of them
Right.
and like what they do provide and everything. But
Okay.
I think it takes up a lot of space. But
Okay.
I guess they're still kind of ominous to me today, honestly. But
Okay.
each
So they're
their own.
imposing, yeah. Okay. So you come from the Don Quixote family, right? If any of you have read Don Quixote and Walking Windmills. So space, ominous. These ones here, incidentally, that you're seeing, very typical for Texas. These are 1.5 megawatt machines. Each one has a capacity to generate 1.5 megawatts. Okay, and again, if you just want to put that in context, the light bulb above your head may be 60 watts, right? There are 1,000 watts in a kilowatt, and there are 1,000 kilowatts in a megawatt, right? So these are big time machines. Incidentally, these ones here, and there are now offshore machines that they're being built that are 10 megawatt machines, but these are very typical onshore wind turbines. These, so here's the nacelle, right? That's this is where the gearbox is. This is generally at about 240 feet or about 80 meters off the ground. So from the ground there, that's up at about 80 meters. And I'll show you why that becomes important in just a little bit. These blades here are generally at about 40 meters, okay? And I don't know, I've had the privilege not just to be close to them, but actually climb up one and get on the top of one as part of our research. When those blades are spinning through the air, and if you're at a distance, and it doesn't look like they're moving very fast, but there's a very simple calculation to determine how fast that tip is moving through the air, right? The tip speed. And very frequently, that tip speed is in excess of 150 miles an hour. It's just impressive. So Claire, if you were standing underneath one and the wind was blowing at 15 or 20 miles an hour, the tip of that thing would be going through the air at about 150 to 175 miles an hour. You would feel even more ominous, I think.
Sounds pretty ominous, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty ominous, but they're pretty darn cool. They're very impressive. So let's talk wind for a little bit. The goal here in wind, everybody, is to just give you a sense as to how they work very briefly, and then we can talk about the environmental impacts when we come back from a cup of coffee. So just to set it within a global context here, at the end of 2019, I haven't found the 2020 data yet. They're still pulling those. Everything's been delayed with COVID. This currently shows the installed wind power capacity around the world. At the end of 2019, there was about 650 gigawatts of installed capacity. That's not an important number. You don't need to remember that. What I would like you to just focus on here is to look at the top 5 countries in terms of installed capacity, right? When I first started working in the wind space, China wouldn't have been on this graphic, okay? The US currently has about 112 gigawatts of installed capacity, okay, of wind, right? That's a huge amount of wind. You can see Germany down here, India, Spain, and look at good old Texas, right? If Texas was an independent country, and according to some people that I know, it should be, we would be 5th in the world, right? We would be just behind India, but ahead of Spain in terms of the sheer number of turbines and the capacity of those turbines on the ground, right? So wind power here in Texas is just a big deal. It's a huge economic driver. Important diagram here. Here's the wind resource map, right? So this map here, just like the solar resource, shows where the wind speeds are economically the most viable. So a couple of things to point out here. First off, let's just look at this. So this is the average annual wind speed at 80 meters, right? It's measured at 80 meters. Why? Because that's where the height of the nacelle in the turbine is, remember, about 240 feet, okay? And we know that wind speed increases with height as you get above the ground. So that's where we measure wind, right? Where the blade is going to be. The second one is, just look at the box here, everybody. This is the scale. It's the average annual wind speed in meters per second, right? Meters per second, average annual wind speed. And this is the really kind of important part of the diagram here, right at around about 6 meters per second, more or less. That is where what we call economically viable wind is. And I'm just going to draw the kind of outline. It's this very light brown that does that, and then it kind of does that, right? Obviously, there are areas here where it's higher, and you go to California, and these little patches over here. But this here in the center, okay, this is the Saudi Arabia of wind when it comes to the United States, right? There is enough wind here in the Midwest to supply the power generation for the United States many, many, many times over, right? We have plenty of wind here to power all of our needs in the United States. What's the but?
Storage.
Yeah, dot, right? The
They
but
haven't found a
is,
way to store it.
so storage, okay, it's one.
Cost of implementation.
Costs, okay, costs of implementation. I'm glad you said that, because we're going to come back and just mention that. So costs of implementation, storage. Linked to your comment, Ahmad, about costs of implementation, where are the people? Where do people live generally?
All in the Midwest.
Yeah, right. We like to live here, okay, and along the coast here. It's not that there's no one here, right? But the majority of the population are east and west coast, right? So if you're generating power instantaneously from wind up here in this incredibly viable zone, right? And if we can solve the perk issue, if we could store it, okay, now we've got to get that power to where people live, if we're going to move it, okay, to the west and east coast. Or we could just say, you know what, wind is just going to be a Midwest thing, end of story, and we're not going to worry about transmission, okay, and getting it to where it is. So there is, you know, right off the bat, everybody, there is a geographical constraint here. I've said before, you implement what the geography gives you, right? So if you want wind, this is where you're going to put it, okay, in the Midwest. If you want solar, then this is where you're going to put it. But it cannot be the silver bullet that solves all of our issues unless we find some magical technology that, one, can store it, and two, can transport it.
So then, like, if that's the case, then why don't we just basically use like the resources that we have in certain areas and like basically divide and conquer? Because wouldn't it be, you know, because in this sense, like doing that to where you use the geographical advantages that you have to generate what you need, wouldn't that solve the problem? It's just a matter of, I guess, who makes the money is the real issue.
So that's an interesting comment, Matt. It's Matt. So it's who makes the money, right? I suppose the implication. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the implication is, okay, let's come back and let's think about climate. Let's think about environment. This is an environmental course, environment and climate, right? And carbon and so on. And so what we do is we say, okay, this is where we'll do wind. That's great. Now, there are some obvious engineering constraints there. And I know you've said storage, and that's a very viable one, right? If you want to build a wind farm, I would suggest you don't go to southern Georgia here. You're not going to make any money, right? The wind doesn't blow. So what does this become? This becomes a nuclear, natural gas, coal-fired region. This becomes maybe a whole bunch of everything, right? And which in a sense is what's going on, Matt, right? When we think about hydroelectric, the way in which we generate electricity, we know that hydroelectric up here in the Pacific Northwest accounts for 67% of all of our, all of our requirements there. So I know we're being very insular here, just talking about the United States. What's going on here is very different to what's going on in every other country, or somewhat different, right? But I take your point. So then who makes the money, and how does that money flow, right? And I'm not suggesting, I should just sort of throw this out there. I'm not suggesting that we've got all this wind and that we have to build transmission, okay, towards the coastlines, because what we can do along the coastlines here is we can build offshore wind farms, okay, which are more expensive, and bring the electrons onshore. We still haven't addressed the whole issue of, I don't want to look at them, and oh, they kill birds, and because that's what we're going to come back and talk about after our tea break, right? Any other thoughts or comments on that? I mean, Texas, you know, leads the way. These are the top 5 states. California led us into the wind age in many ways. Also led us into a lot of bad press building old technology farms in the valleys along which condors and bald eagles fly. That's another issue that we'll talk briefly about. But these are the top 5 states in terms of installed capacity, and that 30,000 megawatts or 30 gigawatts accounts for something like 18 to 20% of our electricity here. Iowa, about 40%, right? Okay. Oh yeah, just to repeat that. The growth of wind has been extraordinary. This shows the wind energy share of state electricity production. This was in 2005, just before we started the wind research. Texas, wind accounted for 1.1% of our electricity, right? Iowa, it accounted for about 4% of the electricity. Look at this now, okay? Wind has grown, Matt, in the geographic region where it should grow, okay? The question is, 1, how far can we push that? Does the Texas 17% become 40% in the next 10 years, right? And 2, can we push that geographically anywhere else? In California, we're pretty much constrained, right? Little easier in Texas with all this private land, okay? Much more difficult in areas where it's government controlled or Bureau of Land Management. And Texas continues. There's something like 40 projects currently under construction. Okay, so why don't we do this? Let's take a quick break. We'll take a break until 9:10. We'll grab some coffee. I'll put the record on pause for a second, everybody. And then we're going to come back and address some. All right, let's continue, everybody. And on 9:10. So let's talk about some of the issues surrounding wind, and in particular the environmental issues. And I will change back to the online website in just a second when I ask you a couple of these questions. So, so Claire made the comment that she finds, when she looks at a landscape like this, she finds these structures quite imposing, and that's a really common reaction, right? I think that the work that we did from 2008 to 2016, right throughout the Midwest, from Texas into Iowa, dealing with questions of visual pollution and connection to landscape, and is this technology a good fit? And questions like, how does the money flow, right? Matt mentioned that. Where, you know, who gets rich, or who makes money and who doesn't. And so when we look at, you know, economics and policy, and that's what I've put in this just sentence to remind me to make this comment, that when we look at how the costs surrounding wind have plummeted over the last 10 to 15 years, and they have, right, for sure, to the point where wind does not need subsidies anymore. It simply do not need to be subsidized, which in fact they used to be, I suppose, like every technology. So despite improving costs, and despite a lot of policy support, at least from the current administration, right, whether wind continues to develop at the rate that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years is going to come down to, or is going to really revolve around acceptance in communities and issues relating to permitting and the environmental issues surrounding permitting, right? And perception's a big one, okay? I just come back and remind you of this term, not in my backyard, and you can see it on the right-hand side. So this cartoon here is is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but in fact, it's very often the argument that the environmental lobby that people who are pro-renewables make, right? And that is that, you know, when people are so strongly opposed to putting wind turbines in a particular region, in a particular community, right? This whole "not in my backyard" thing is one of the issues, and perhaps, and actually, to be really honest, it was the issue that we came up against all others, right? And that is that a lot of people said, look, we understand wind turbines make money, we understand that they're good for the climate and so on, but we just don't want to look at them, right? We find they're ugly. And yet we seem to be okay with all of the byproducts of other technologies, right? Whether it would be the potential for a nuclear disaster, as Matt, you said, when things go wrong, they go badly wrong, or an oil spill, or the atmospheric surrounding coal, right? So what we did is we went through communities stretching from San Angelo, Texas, all the way up through to communities in Kansas and Iowa, trying to really understand the motivation behind opposition and support, right? And I don't just mean acceptance, I mean really support, truly saying, all right, we understand that, you know, that renewables are potentially an important part of the process, right? And so this was a very common, this is not my photograph, but it was a very common response, you know, that we saw in these communities, right? Rather skeptical views, like this lady here in the blue in the front, or the guy in the back left with his hand on his head going, you know, I've kind of heard enough of this. This is a very, very common concern. And that is that when we would go into a community, try and understand the motives behind opposition and support, right? It was very rare. In fact, I can't think of a single time that we would find a group that were there who vocalized their support, right? It was almost always opposition that wind turbines would be bad for the economy, that they would impact their land values and their housing prices, that they would impact humans, right? You know, the President Trump, not to make a political statement, but he came out on the record saying that wind turbines potentially cause cancer when there is absolutely no evidence of that. That they are noisy, that they kill birds. You know, there was a whole host of environmental issues, and it was very, in a sense, easy for people on my side of the fence just to say, you know what, you're all dumb and stupid. But maybe they're not. Maybe there are people in this photograph that you're looking at that have a truly deep connection to a place and don't want to look at wind turbines. I remember sitting down with a gentleman up on a beautiful mesa in West Texas overlooking one of those valleys. And he said, you know, Mike, I came out here to retire. I bought this nice little beautiful plot of land. I built my dream cabin, and now I get to look at 300 turbines every night, you know. Did he have a point? Absolutely, right? So I just throw that out there as something to think about, right? It's very easy to kind of be self-righteous, I think, in the renewable space and say, look, all of you are wrong. We need these wind turbines because we need to save the climate. That argument didn't go very far in Texas. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts or comments on that.
I bet if you turn out the lights and that's the only way to get them back on, they'd be okay with it.
Yeah, maybe, right? Yeah, people don't like to sit in the dark. You know, this is Hawaii, and I had a wonderful week there in May. And again, I don't know what your gut reaction to something like this is. When you look at this and you go on a hike in Hawaii and you come around the corner, is this what the view is meant to look like when you go on a hike? So when you look at a picture like this, do you see visual pollution, or do you see, wow, that's cool, technological advancement and clean, renewable, efficient, safe, reliable energy? I don't know, right? Just depends on one's perspective, I guess. Okay. People have a deep connection to place. So these are the results, just FYI, of a survey we did over a 3-year period from Texas all the way to Iowa. We mailed out questionnaires, about 15,000 questionnaires, They were targeted people, some who lived in close proximity to wind turbines, some who didn't, some who could see turbines. Each questionnaire was geolocated, although there was no personal data taken, but we were interested in people's perceptions of wind energy, okay? And so issues driving opposition to wind farm. We found 4 major issues driving opposition to wind farm, right? The percentage here and the green part of this pie chart are those who agreed or strongly agreed. And I've just lumped those two together, right? So 18% of all the respondents that we surveyed here agreed or strongly agreed that wind turbines create noise. 33% said they were unattractive. Interestingly, 33% were like, I don't care. And 33% said, we don't think they're unattractive, we think they're cool. So that was an interesting split. About 20% said they're a danger to wildlife, and about 23% said they are unreliable. And those are very typical numbers, I think, here that you find in the US. When we asked them about the money, okay, 70% plus said they wanted to see more wind farms in their communities. Why? Because it created jobs and it benefited their county, right? They saw significant improvements to their schools. They saw electronic scoreboards at their Friday night football games. They started seeing more revenue coming into the local restaurants and so on. So it came down to, not surprisingly, show me the money, right? Kind of interesting. So let me just exit there for a second. I'm going to stop the share and I want to come back and ask you folks. Let's just see if this works for one quick second. Let me share the screen. Oh, okay. There we go. Let's see if this works. All right. If you guys wouldn't mind just going to, okay. Matt, did that change to the survey thingy here?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. If you folks wouldn't mind just doing this for me for a second, so I can just get a sense as to where you stand, right? If you wouldn't mind going into this code here and answering these 2 slides. So the code is 15952984. 15952984. And the first question I just wanted to pose to you is, do you think wind turbines create noise? Okay. Wind turbines create noise. Let's see what you think. Cool. Getting some answers here for it. See if we can get a higher N value if you wouldn't mind. So we're at about 45% of the class. Wind turbines create noise. And again, you may have no experience in wind turbines, so that's absolutely okay. Again, that code is 15952984. There we go, 14 people. Cool. Okay. Interesting. 15. So about 50% of you agree that wind turbines create noise. All right. What about wind turbines being unattractive? I think wind turbines are unattractive. What do you think of this one? Let's see. Remember, from the response of about 15,000 surveys that were mailed, we had a third. Okay, interesting. All right. 12 of you agree, neutral. Yeah. So as you fill this out, let's just let this continue to populate. If any of you answered you agree that they're unattractive, and again, I'm not, there's no grades associated with any right or wrong answer here. Would someone like to just expand upon why you answered that? Is it just, do you have personal experience in that, or do you just look at that and think, metal, ugly, don't want to look at it, ruins the landscape? Or vice versa, anybody in the disagree who think they aren't unattractive? Is it just I think these things are cool, or anybody want to expand upon that?
I think they look a lot better than like smokestacks coming out of factories. I went to school just down the street from like a couple factories, and there were smokestacks coming out of them all day.
Right.
And
Yeah, yeah.
I think wind turbines look just fine. I've never had a problem with them. Drive past them when you drive up to Oklahoma and Kansas.
Mm.
I think they look pretty cool to me.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And you can see in just a small sampling, right? So we've got 14 of you have filled this out. You know, that's a small n value, but still, you know, something like 25, almost 30% of you agree that they're unattractive, and that's really typical, right? That's typical of the types of responses we see, and it's not that you in the blue are correct or incorrect, and vice versa in the red are correct or incorrect, right? It is what it is. It's a personal decision. It's a personal reflection on what you think of a technology like this. You know, if I'm totally honest, I do not think they're unattractive. I'm not sure I'd want to look at one off you know, my back patio at night when the sun's setting, just to be totally honest. Right? But I also understand that this is a technology that is enormously promising in terms of addressing climate change. Okay, so here's an interesting comment, Kylie. I think it ruins the landscape aesthetically, especially in places like Ireland and England. Ooh, talk to me quickly on that, if you can hear me.
Yes, sir. I guess I just sometimes, like, where I've seen them in these very remote, like, little areas, they're just kind of almost take over the whole little town. And so I'm not saying that they're not important. I just think it's this typically undisturbed area, and then there's this giant technology there, and it just kind of, I don't know, it just doesn't look right. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair, right? We're currently in an interesting discussion with what's going on in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, where we're working on the Rhino project. And, you know, there's 10 private game reserves and a couple of national parks there. And as I've said, South Africa is struggling with load shedding, with running blackouts, right? Rolling blackouts. They need energy, they need electricity, and they have an enormous wind resource in that part of South Africa, the Eastern Cape, if any of you know where I'm talking about. And wind developers want to come in and put turbines in. And one developer has put turbines in up near a town called Grahamstown, up on a ridge, right? So Kylie, here's the deal. You go to South Africa for a safari, you're driving around a beautiful unspoiled landscape looking at lions and elephants and giraffes and so on. And off in the distance, if you're in a certain part of these game reserves, you can see wind turbines. It just doesn't feel right, right? I don't think people go to South Africa to go on safari to look at wind turbines. So they are really struggling because they know they need the electricity. To a T, everybody who's a landowner there thinks that we should address the climate issue and develop renewable resources. But they just don't want to look at them because that's going to impact a tourism-based economy, right? And I think your point, Kylie, in the UK is very well taken, especially in a place like Scotland. I haven't been to Ireland, so I can't talk, but I know in Scotland, that I know quite well, people have a real connection to the hills, access to the hills, hiking, footpaths, and so on. And there's quite a backlash against them, right? So I think that's a really, really valid point. Okay, cool. I won't ask I was going to do a second poll, but let's move on, because those are two of the big ones that I hear often a lot, that they impact landscapes, and they're just pretty unattractive. Again, at the end of the day, it came down to money, and as long as people were benefiting economically, they seem to be happy with it. This is a really big one. I just want to address this briefly, right? This was a significant part of our research, and that is, can wind turbines coexist with the ecology, with wildlife? Okay, so those who oppose wind turbines will say that these things kill birds, right? That they are basically KitchenAid blenders when it comes to killing birds. Now, if something flies into a spinning wind turbine moving through the air at 160 miles an hour, they're going to die, right? It's as simple as that. The question is, how do we get a perspective? And how do we trade that off against the need for electricity? Same comments relate to the desert tortoise, right? So as part of the team, one of my colleagues, Tori Bennett, and some people in biology embarked on a 5-year part of this research project, incredibly time-consuming, laborious, expensive work, trying to determine how many birds and bats were wind turbines actually killing. In other words, what is the science really telling us, right? And I won't get into the details on that. All I will say is that when it comes down to perspective, okay, this is what the data looks like from a paper in 2015 and using data, widespread data around the United States, right? Wind turbines kill on average about 500,000 birds, okay? They do. And sometimes, unfortunately, they're large glamorous species, right? Like an eagle, okay? Can we live with that relative to the number of birds that are killed by cars, buildings, and feral cats, right? So you look at the line, so it's an order of magnitude up to power line electrocutions. 5.5 million birds a year on average die from electrocution through power lines, okay? We think that buildings through collisions are something like 500 million. So take a step back, and if you're a pro-wind person, you go, well, hang on a second, we're not killing billions and billions of birds. We're killing some, all right? And can we trade that off against the electrons that are coming out that are emissions free, okay? Can Jacob live with 500,000 bird deaths relative to looking at dirty polluting smokestacks? I don't know. You folks tell me. So I'm just cautioning you, when you look at the backlash against a technology like wind, we do have to put it in perspective. And I'm not suggesting for a moment, everybody, that it's absolutely okay to kill California condors or 500,000 birds, right? But we do have to look at things in context, I think.
Do you think it's that it's unnatural to a certain extent, and that's why the backlash is there, that there's the cons are exemplified so much greater than they would in a normal setting, because no one's like, all right, we need to eliminate all cats because they're killing birds, or it's that. So like, it's like the backlash is there. Do you just think it's because it's the unnatural thing that people are like, well, we can't do this because this is not what's normal?
Right. No, absolutely, Matt. It's an externally imposed artificial landscape, right? It's a technology that we're putting in place that are killing these things, for sure, right? And to be totally transparent, the situation with bats could be more problematic, depending on where you are and depending on how you manage your particular wind farm, right? So when we take a step back and say, okay, we don't want to have 30 gigawatts of installed capacity in Texas. We want to have 300 gigawatts of installed capacity, okay? That would essentially take all of our coal-fired power plants offline. How do we trade that off and the potential impact on bird populations relative to what taking the coal-fired power plants might do relative to mercury contamination, right? It's just all a bunch of environmentally based but socioeconomic, trade-offs. And I agree completely that it's an energy landscape. It's an artificial energy landscape. So again, to use your phrase, self-preservation. Yeah, tricky, right? So is wind power a realistic alternative? It is, right? But there are some caveats. Here's one of the caveats, okay? Let me just come back to this notion of capacity factor for a second. So I often get the question, all right, Mike, so you're pro wind and you want to build all these wind farms, right? I often get the question, so how many houses can a wind turbine support, right? If we put up one of these wind turbines that you see on the left here, so this is a wind farm. Someone mentioned, Jacob, I think it was you who mentioned you drive up to Oklahoma. This is a wind farm right on the Oklahoma-Texas border, okay? And these are 1.5 megawatt machines. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, well, let me try and explain for a second what that really means. Okay, here's a little calculation. Actually, I'd really like you to be able to do this in the exam. It's a very, very simple calculation. Right? How many houses can a wind turbine support? So here's how you calculate that. Here's a wind turbine, and it can generate 1.5 megawatts of power. That's its rating, right? Or 1,500 kilowatts. But let's just work in megawatts for a minute. So one wind turbine that is rated at 1.5 megawatts, if it's spinning at its optimum speed, now obviously as the wind starts, the wind starts increasing in speed, and the wind turbine starts spinning slower and slower and slower, and then they speed up. And eventually, if the wind keeps building, it will rotate and speed and generate electricity at its 1.5 megawatt capacity, right? So let's say we've got a wind turbine that can generate 1.5 megawatts. If it is spinning for 24 hours a day, every single day of the year, at its optimum capacity, in other words, it's generating 1.5 megawatts every hour of the day, 365 days a year, that's 8,750 hours, right? So if it's turning for 8,750 hours, that wind turbine could generate 13,125 megawatt hours of energy. Just 8,750 hours times 1.5 megawatts. Everybody with me? Please stop me if that doesn't make sense. Again, it would be like having a 60-watt light bulb on for 10 hours. That's 60 watts times 10 hours is 600 watt hours. Here we're just dealing with a much larger amount of energy, right? It's operating at its maximum optimum capacity. It could potentially generate 13,000 megawatt hours. Wind turbines do not spin for 24 hours a day for 365 days a year. And sometimes that wind falls below its speed to generate 1.5 megawatts, right? In the US, wind turbines generally, on average, and that's a general on average, operate at about a 30% capacity factor, right? Meaning that instead of generating 13,000 megawatts hours, they generate just around about a third of that, or call it 4,000 megawatt hours, 3,938 megawatt hours, right? That's the actual amount of energy that a wind turbine in the US on average produces. Does that make sense to everybody? Now the question is, how much energy does an average household in the United States consume? Our average annual consumption in the US is about 11.5 megawatt hours per year per household, right? So if each household in the US is consuming about 11.5 megawatt hours, then how many households does one wind turbine support? Well, you just take 3,938 divided by 11.5 megawatt hours of energy. What does that leave you with, right? That leaves you with about 340 households on average. Now that number varies tremendously depending on where you are in the world, okay? You can have a wind turbine producing 4,000 megawatt hours, and if your consumption is what it is on average in, you know, let's say Botswana, a country that neighbors South Africa, that consumption is probably going to be down to something like 1 to 2 megawatt hours per year, right? Because they don't have 5,000 square foot houses with their air conditioners running 24/7 during the summer. Does that make sense to everybody, right? Now, that doesn't mean to say that you can put up 340 houses and build one turbine and say, here we go, here's your wind turbine, knock yourselves out. That's going to provide enough electricity for the year. It doesn't work like that, right? All I'm saying is that you can look at the amount of energy that a wind turbine produces on average in any particular region and calculate about how many households that would support. I just want to make sure everybody's happy with that or comfortable with that. All good. So if we're talking about parity, everybody, if we want to look at wind turbines versus other types of technology, right? This is what it would look like. So these are some of the latest 5 megawatt turbines that are being built offshore. Currently, there's no offshore wind in the United States. Right? A lot of this is occurring in the North Sea and other parts of the world. So these are 5 megawatt turbines. These are large turbines in the North Sea, actually off Denmark. Okay. And if you wanted to build the same number of, if you wanted to generate the same number of electrons that would come out of your average nuclear power plant, so your average nuclear power plant is rated at about 1 gigawatt, right, of energy per year, 1 gigawatt. Remember, a coal-fired power plant is about 500 megawatts. 2 coal-fired power plants is 1 gigawatt. So the nuclear power plant is generally about 1 gigawatt per year, right? You would actually need to build about 450 of these offshore turbines. Okay, now 450 times 5 doesn't equal that. I get that, because remember, you've still got to build in the capacity factor, right? So this is about 2,500 megawatts. And then you've got to see what the capacity factor is. My point is simply that if you're going to compare wind with solar, with nuclear, with coal, and all of these other technologies, clearly, because of the intermittency and the capacity factors, you have to build far more wind turbines than a nuclear power plant. So why wouldn't we just build more nuclear power plants? Well, for all the reasons that we talked about on Tuesday, right? Okay, thoughts, comments, or questions on wind? Wind and solar, those are the 2 big ones I wanted to just touch on. See something lighting up in the chat. Matthew, so basically, if we can find long-term storage, nuclear should be what we are pushing. Why do we need long-term storage to push nuclear? Why wouldn't we just push nuclear, Matt?
Because obviously there's some impacts that can happen based on the shelf life of the used fuel.
Okay.
And so we obviously need to be able to have a way to displace it to where it doesn't have a significant impact down the road.
Yeah, okay. Several people and several very, very prominent scientists have argued that what you're looking at on the screen here, right, the combination of wind and wind and nuclear, right, is the only logical way forward if we want to minimize climate change, right? So that's a topic we've still got to talk about, right? But this is the argument that this is the future. This is the way to move forward, okay? The combination of wind and nuclear. Nuclear, I will tell you right now, and I was going to do this right at the end, and we'll probably run out of time. But nuclear gives you the biggest bang for your buck. What is the capacity factor of a nuclear power plant? About 93 to 95%. In other words, once you switch a nuclear power plant on, the only time you switch it off is to switch out the fuel or to do any kind of maintenance, right? So not only is the nuclear reaction the most powerful, but once you switch it on, you're good. Okay, so the capacity factor of a nuclear power plant is 95%. The capacity factor of an onshore wind farm here in West Texas is about 30%. Capacity factors of the wind turbine that you see here in the North Sea, probably something like 40 to 45%, right? Incidentally, everybody, the maximum amount of energy that you can extract from a wind field, okay, is 59%. You cannot extract any more. If you're interested in that, you can look that up. That's known as Betz's law, B-E-T-Z, right? Because if you've got wind coming along, let's say you've got wind coming along here and it's coming to this wind turbine. If you are going to extract 100% of all of the energy out of that wind field, guess what's happening on this side of the wind turbine? There's no wind, right? The wind stops, which clearly doesn't happen. The wind flows through these wind turbines. So 59, actually it's 59.5%. 59.5% is the absolute maximum that you can extract out of a wind field, right? So right off the bat, your renewables, like wind and solar, by definition, they're limited. That doesn't mean to say they're uneconomical. It doesn't mean to say they don't work. It just means until we either solve the storage issue, right, where we can put electrons into storage and then discharge them when they're needed, we're going to have to rely on a combination of renewables, but baseload technologies like nuclear, natural gas, or coal to provide that background base load, right? I hope that makes sense to everyone. Here's another one, right? I don't want to spend huge amounts of time talking about hydroelectric. I'll make just a few comments. So I'm going to do hydroelectric power an enormous disservice here by just spending 5 minutes on it. Hydroelectric is an enormously efficient form of electricity generation. It's just simply damming a river, right? Creating a reservoir and then storing that potential energy behind the dam. In other words, you let that water build up behind the dam and you let it go down a spillway to turn a turbine along the way to generate the electricity. So hydroelectric power is very efficient and very important in many parts of the world. This is currently the largest hydroelectric plant that's out there, the Three Gorges Dam, right? And when we look at the United States, another one of these little interesting data plots, this is hydroelectricity generation as a share, as a percentage of US. So this is the total amount of energy or electricity generated in kilowatt hours. And this is the percentage as a total, right? And you can see this from 1950, right? So 1950, 1960s, lots of big dams being built. But from about the 1970s, the amount of hydroelectric power that's actually being generated in the US is pretty static, right? This is dependent on some climate cycles and reservoir capacity and so on. But this is a pretty static, 50-year trend. But as a percentage, hydroelectric used to account for about 25% of all our electricity. Now it's about 7%, okay? So that is a continually decline. Why? Because other technologies like wind and solar are being built in. And two, not only are we not building any new dams in the US, we're actually taking dams out, right? If you look at what's going on in the Pacific Northwest at smaller scales to try and remove dams from rivers to allow salmon to spawn and so on, hydroelectric in the US is on the decline, right? And again, the technology is elegant, simple, and straightforward. So you build a dam, you dam the water, you let that water go downstream under gravity. Incidentally, everybody, Matt, you've mentioned storage here a couple of times so far, right? In parts of the world, and this is actually going on in California, when there is excess wind at a wind farm, they use that electricity to pump water up to a reservoir, and then they store that in a reservoir upstream, and that's known as pumped storage. That's not electrons going into a battery to be discharged. That's using the electricity generated by a wind farm to pump water uphill and store it, and then let that trickle down and turn a smaller scale. So just incidentally, when you mention storage, I always try and think about pump storage as something to mention. The environmental impacts of dams, of course, are enormous potentially, right? You are dramatically changing the hydrology, the water course, and the surrounding communities. Here's a very controversial one that's going in. It's called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and it's controversial because it is damming one leg of the Nile River in Ethiopia, and that water then flows from Ethiopia into Egypt, right? So, one country controls the damming, but that water ends up going downstream into another country. So there are enormous sort of geopolitical issues going on over there. I'm going to use this. I'm not going to talk about this particular dam in Turkey, other than just to make the comments that there are upstream and downstream impacts when you build a dam, right? And it's a whole range of potential impacts. You disrupt the water and sediment flow downstream. You change the nature of the hydrologic cycle. For example, the Aswan Dam that went in on the Nile River in Egypt dramatically changed the downstream hydrologic regime. It reduced the number of times the Nile would flood the valley and increase the nutrients and the sediments in the floodplains on which the agriculture is built. So you build a dam to reduce flooding, that's great, but you dramatically change the natural hydrology and sedimentology both upstream and downstream. So it's not that, dams aren't being built around the world, but there's certainly very few, I don't know of any large dam projects that are going on. The Three Gorges Dam, they had to displace about 1.5 million people from the valley upstream because it got flooded. They had to flood that valley, and they were flooding towns, and so they moved people, right? People don't like to be moved around because you're putting in a technology like a dam. So hydroelectric, I don't see a huge amount of scope for that being built out as a potential long-term solution, really. one, because it's expensive, and two, because the environmental impacts are pretty widespread. And then let me just end off this morning and just talk very, very briefly about biomass, right? Biomass energy, and the question, we grow ourselves out of the energy crisis. This is another tricky one, right? I made the comment earlier on that 2 billion people currently get their energy from biomass, burning things like wood and peat around the world. And that will almost certainly change over time as we move forward. What I mean here, really, from a US perspective or a kind of developing world perspective, are biofuels, right? Biomass sources. So where do we get our energy from in terms of biomass as a renewable one? A lot of this work, a lot of the attention is focused up here, right? On biofuels, crops like growing corn and soybeans and so on, and using the ethanol, producing ethanol from those as a significant source. So this up here is where a lot of the controversy currently exists, and why I framed the question, can we grow ourselves out of the energy crisis? So just very briefly, biofuels is really where the focus is, certainly in the US. There are three different currently, there are three different types of biofuels. We talk about first generation biofuels, right? First generation biofuels are where you grow a crop like corn on the left-hand side, you process that, and instead of eating it, you process that into ethanol, right? So when you fill up your car, if you're not driving an electric vehicle, I put gas in my car this morning, and when you look on the side of the gas pump, what do you see on the side of that gas pump? A certain percentage of the gasoline is made up of ethanol, right? I think in the US here, we generally use E85 as the ethanol mixture, cleaner burning, and it helps the combustion process. So we would use things like corn or potatoes or sugarcane to grow crops to produce ethanol. We also use things like soybeans or alfalfa to produce something like biodiesel. So that's first generation biofuel, growing crops to produce the fuel, right? Incidentally, ethanol has about 70% of the energy context of gasoline, right? So if you're going to switch over to a fully ethanol future, you've got to grow a lot of it, just incidentally. There are second generation biofuels. So second generation biofuels are where you take the crop residue and then you reprocess that and ferment it into biofuels. So you're taking the cellulosic material. So for example, you would grow corn and you would harvest the corn and produce the ethanol from the corn, and then all of the crop residuals that's left over, you then use that to produce cellulosic biofuel, a little more expensive, and it cannot be done at the same scale as first generation biofuels. And then speaking of scale, there's third generation biofuels, right, where we're using things like algae. And again, scale here has been the limiting factor. So there's a lot of experimental work going on in terms of growing vertical algae and just letting the algae grow using the sun, and then the oils that are produced as part of photosynthesis, using that as biofuels. So first, second, third generation biofuels, but there are environmental issues associated with that. The US Congress just incidentally gave the American farmer a mandate that they just simply could not refuse. This was done in the early 2000s in President Bush's administration. So this diagram here shows the growth in ethanol production in millions of gallons from the 1980s to 2019, right? And so what happened here to cause this dramatic increase? Well, what happened was in the early 2000s, Congress passed an act that said we needed to dramatically ramp up our biofuel production, okay? You don't need to worry about exactly what those percentages are. And the American farmer responded, right? And started growing more and more biofuels to produce ethanol. We are actually well short of what those targets should be, but this little inset box here kind of always gets my attention, right? About half, a little more than half, of all the corn grown in Iowa is used to produce ethanol. What's wrong with that picture, everybody? Why is that a concern? Half of all the corn in Iowa is used to produce ethanol.
We're not eating that corn. We could use the food.
Right? So, yeah, we're taking all of that corn and we're producing ethanol to increase our gas mileage, to increase our consumption, and to put it into our vehicles. And yet 800 million people go to bed hungry at night. I know that seems a little idealistic. What is the likelihood of taking all of that corn and getting it directly into people's stomachs? That's a whole nother issue, right? But just conceptually, that is something that I struggle with, right? That we're growing food to put into our cars, and yet people go to bed hungry. I don't get it, but okay. You know, I'm actually just going to skip that slide, so don't worry about that. A large component, and I'll just wrap this up because I've got a couple of minutes here. A real focus on biofuels comes down to land, food, and the impact on the hydrologic cycle, right? If we're growing food to use as fuel, why aren't we growing food to use as food, right? And that's what this little infographic tries to sort of underline here. Yeah, about a people will go to bed hungry tonight, and yet we'll turn 5 billion bushels of corn into ethanol. That's enough to feed 400 million people for an entire year. Why are we not able to do this? What is going on here that precludes us from changing the way we consume and use when there are just so many people in a very different space, right? Again, I'm not trying to sound sort of lectury or self-righteous. It just, that's currently is what it is. And that just doesn't really sit right with me. So having said all that, what I will do tomorrow is I'm just going to spend 5 or so minutes, maybe 10, putting our discussion on energy, bringing that to completion. Then we're going to talk about air quality, and then we'll talk about stratospheric ozone, right? So, and air quality and stratospheric ozone are all linked to energy production and consumption. So we're going to start to build upon these lectures, but move away from energy at the moment. All right, everybody, thoughts, comments, questions? I know I went pretty long today, about as long as I needed to. But any other final thoughts or comments or questions? There may be a couple of slides in the energy material that we don't get to. All good, all good. Okay. Well, thanks. Great to see you all. Again, please, I encourage you, if you are concerned about your grade on the first exam, please reach out and we can chat. Other than that, have a super Thursday, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
You bet, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep, yep.